And I would like to invite our first speaker, Professor Malcolm Tull from the School of Management and Governance of Murdoch University in Australia. And so he is going to present us maritime infrastructure and heritage dynamics. So thank you for your...
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd particularly like to thank Andrea and NTEU for establishing this conference and for inviting myself and, of course, the other delegates as well. Now, I'll see if I can get the technology going. Okay. This is an outline of the talk. I'm going to basically talk about some of the characteristics of maritime infrastructure, review of the changes in technology in shipping which have affected this infrastructure, look at the impacts on ports, look at the issue of maritime heritage, what is maritime heritage, and how do we value it, and then look at waterfront redevelopment, particularly with a focus on a case study on the port of Fremantle in Western Australia, which is just happens to be where I'm from, and then a few conclusions. I hardly need to tell everyone here, of course, that the maritime industry is a globalised industry par excellence. We've seen in some of the presentations so far, of course, that this globalised nature of shipping has a long history, a much longer history than used to be traditionally recognised. It's dynamic, it's globalised, and it means that the actors and agents in that industry have to be responsive to international trends. Now, we build maritime infrastructure to facilitate the movement of goods, of people, but increasingly, of course, the emphasis is on goods. As has already been mentioned, 90% of world trade is carried by vessels today. Relatively few people travel, except, of course, on cruise liners. Maritime infrastructure has also been built, of course, for defensive purposes. And this is of particular relevance in many countries when we deal with the issues of maritime heritage. It includes, of course, deep water channels, breakwaters, jetties, wharves, dry docks, slipways, cargo sheds, cargo handling equipment such as cranes. So there's a wide range of material that we can basically broadly classify as maritime infrastructure. Now, this infrastructure has a number of key characteristics. The first one is that it tends to be what's called a lumpy investment. You know, you can't have half of a deep water channel or half of a berth. You really have to build the whole thing at once. And so it's kind of all or nothing in that sense. And the other characteristic is that it's very large expense, particularly if you've got to do major dredging and major preparation and simply the building infrastructure, building wharves and so on. It's not cheap, it's very expensive, both in the past and, of course, today as well. And historically, obviously, governments have played a key role in providing this maritime infrastructure, very often motivated more by defence than by trade. But of course, what we've seen since the latter part of the 20th century is particularly an increased role for the private sector in the provision of maritime infrastructure. And again, this will potentially certainly have some implications for maritime heritage issues down the track. Another characteristic of maritime infrastructure is that it's long-lived. You know, in other words, if you build a wharf and you build it properly, which of course doesn't always happen, then it should last for a long time. You know, that we could talk, 80, 100 years, even longer. And we're all familiar, of course, with harbours and facilities in some parts of the world that are many hundreds of years old. And so basically then, if it's maintained, it can be usable for many years. What often interrupts this, of course, is technological change. Technological change is a disruptor. It can make facilities that otherwise would work perfectly for many years redundant. Classic example in the ports industry is the finger pier, and I'll give you some illustrations of these later, but these were the long, narrow piers that traditionally were built in ports to handle cargo. Well, they worked well in the days of break bulk cargo handling, but they were useless for handling containers, and so they became obsolete overnight, even if those structures themselves were still perfectly serviceable. Infrastructure, as I've said, is long-lived, but of course it can be damaged, it can be destroyed. And this can be either by natural factors or, of course, by deliberate action, military action, bombing, and so forth. Maritime infrastructure is vulnerable to storms and tsunamis and other extreme weather events. And of course, we've seen quite a bit of discussion in recent times about the impact of climate change and its potential implication for shore-based maritime infrastructure. And of course, ports sometimes are the scene of tragic accidents as well, which can destroy infrastructure. I mean, there are many examples, but one of the classics is the explosion in Halifax during the First World War, Halifax, a Canadian port, which was more or less obliterated when an explosion occurred on a ship carrying explosives, and there was a massive explosion that caused very significant loss of life. So infrastructure can be damaged, it can be destroyed, both by natural and man-made factors. Now, given the audience, I know you'll be familiar with the history of shipping technology, but I just want to briefly go through it because it has significant implications for the nature of the maritime infrastructure. Of course, in the 19th century, we see that transition from sail to steam in terms of propulsion of ships, very well known, obviously. Perhaps what is less well appreciated is the application of steam to shore-based facilities, to winches, to cranes, which obviously facilitated the handling of cargo on shore. Instead of having to use manual methods, you could use cranes powered by steam. Early in the 20th century, and this is obviously leaping forward a little bit, we see the introduction of bulk handling of what are called homogeneous cargoes, such as coal, oil and grain. And these cargoes had the characteristics that they were more amenable to mechanisation than were the so-called general cargoes. That's the odds and ends, the boxes, the packages, the barrels, and so forth, which proved more harder to mechanise. And so we see the beginning of bulk handling of grain in the early years of the 20th century. We see the development of pipelines later in the 20th century for moving oil, for example. But until the 1940s, the handling of general cargo was basically very labour intensive. Okay, they used a few cranes on the ships and on the shores, but basically it was a manual task. The first time signs of change occurred around about the 1940s when unitisation and palletisation appeared. And this was facilitated by the development of the forklift truck, which meant you could package goods and put them on a pallet and then handle them on a forklift truck. And this was, in a sense, an intermediate technology before we move in to the later development of containerisation. And then, of course, in the 1950s, we have the tendency to increase ship size and the development of the huge bulk carriers, with which we're all very familiar today. So that, in a nutshell, is really an overview of some of the broader changes in shipping technology. This is an image of an American wharf. I'm not sure what year it was taken in, but I think it was definitely before the Second World War. And it shows a classic finger pier, which is this long, narrow pier with the wharf shed on the back of it. And so the cargo is handled between the ship and into the wharf shed, or vice versa, obviously, for exports. And so here we see the classic hand cart pushed by a man. We've got a lot of manual labour to use. They're using a pulley system to help handle these bags, which could have had grain, probably grain or something of that kind in it. But essentially you can see it's a very primitive operation, really, technologically, very labour intensive. And this was the typical scene at most ports, certainly prior to the Second World War. The one main exception in terms of mechanisation, as I've already mentioned, was the crane, which benefited enormously, of course, from the introduction of steam power. Obviously, cranes predated steam power, but steam power increased their capacity enormously. And it's very interesting that these artefacts have been preserved in a number of cases. On the left, you've got the very unusual banana-shaped crane, steam-powered crane, which was, it's in the port of Bristol. It was built in 1878. And fortunately, instead of being scrapped, dismantled, it's actually been preserved, and the Port Authority occasionally steams it up and runs it. On the right-hand side, we have the shot from the Antwerp Museum. Antwerp has, I think, the largest crane collection in the world. That is of genuine objects of cranes, not simply models or pictures. I had the fortune to be in Antwerp earlier this year, in fact, for a conference. And I said to some colleagues, well, I'm going off to have a look at the Crane Museum. And I had one or two very strange looks because it's not most people's idea of fun. But I wanted to have a look at this museum because I'd read about it. And there they have, I think it's about 16 cranes, which are not in operating condition, but which represent typical examples of the cranes that used to be characteristic of ports around the world. Here we have a shot of a forklift truck. Now, forklifts came in the 1940s. They, as far as I've been able to discover, they were developed in the United States. And then as the American forces travelled around the world during the Second World War, they took forklifts with them, and they used them to speed up cargo handling, not only on the wharves, but also, of course, across the logistics chain. And they were a very interesting intermediate technology. You could use them more or less on the existing wharves and in the existing wharf sheds, although they weren't perfect for them. But at the same time, they've facilitated a rapid increase in cargo handling. And there's a quote there, "The venerable forklift truck, little change from today's modern versions, allowed a human to pick up, move and set down large loads faster than ever before." Here we have a picture from my home port, Fremantle, some shots of the 1920s, again showing typical scenes of a port of that period, the finger pier, the workers handling barrels or man handling sacks. Very typical of that era. Okay, let's move forward, and of course we have the technology of containerisation. This was the brainchild of the American entrepreneur Malcolm McLean. He came up with this idea of moving cargo in boxes and containers, and this is a shot of his first container ship, the Ideal X, in 1956. And I've taken this illustration from Donovan and Bonnie's book, The Box That Changed the World, because really the container is that ubiquitous symbol of globalisation. You find them all around the world, used for many tasks today. Containerisation again, this is an example of the first container ships coming to Australia. Particularly significant, see this shot of the wharves at Fremantle. You can see the modern container wharf, and it's a large area of flat land. The old wharf sheds are obsolete, and the old cranes have gone to be replaced by the modern container crane. Very different world. So these changes then, these changes in technology, have had significant implications, of course, for ports and port cities. It's driven organisational change, and I'm not going to go into details of this today, but huge changes in port governance. It's seen the rise of multinational port operators like the Port of Singapore Authority, for example, which operate globally. It's affected the physical geography of ports. It's led to the removal of the old wharf sheds and their replacement by modern structures. It's had huge implications for the number and employment condition of waterside workers who used to be employed casually. It was an industry characterised by larger industrial unrest and industrial militancy. These days, of course, it's a very small number of workers permanently employed usually, and of course enjoying high wages. It's also affected the traditional character of harbour towns. The quotation there is I've taken from a book by Frank Brose, a leading Australian maritime historian, but it's one that can be applied generally, and I quote, "The port city as a social phenomenon has largely ceased to exist. Despite the huge space taken up by harbours and ancillary installations, Australia's port cities have in fact become general cities that also happen to contain ports." And I think this is really one of the crucial issues that's been referred to by other speakers and affecting, of course, perceptions of heritage and maritime heritage. So what is it? I guess I'd like to try and get a definition. I've taken this one from Claessen's paper. He defines maritime heritage as follows: Maritime cultural heritage is made up of finite and non-renewable cultural resources, including coastal or submerged, prehistoric and indigenous archaeological sites and landscapes, historic waterfront structures, the remnants of seagoing vessels, and the maritime traditions and lifeways of the past and present. Note that's a very broad definition. It's actually not just simply about physical structures. It goes beyond that. It talks about maritime traditions and lifeways. Now, obviously, when we come up with a concept like maritime heritage, one of the key issues and problems with this is how do we value it? How do we assess it? And there are two key aspects. There's the market aspect and the non-market aspect. So the market aspect, first of all, is relatively straightforward. We can say, okay, we can reuse buildings, historic buildings, we can use them for living accommodation for businesses and tourism, museums, recreation. And we can usually put a value on that, a monetary value on that. But how do we value the non-market or intrinsic or existence values that are not reflected in prices? How do we value the ability to visit a maritime museum located in a port area, to experience a working waterfront, to recognise religious and spiritual values, and this is especially important for some indigenous peoples. Just one concrete example, for instance, the wreck of the Titanic, as you know, is located deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Most of us are not likely to get the opportunity to view it up close, but we would nevertheless feel a sense of loss if someone had been allowed to simply blow it up, salvage it, destroy it in some way. And so the issue then, the complex issue, is how do we value that asset? And the key point here, of course, is that in order to make an informed decision about cultural conservation, we need to have some notion of what are the market and non-market values of those heritage items. And there are some valuation tools that can be used to try and value non-market values, but I don't have time to go into details of that today. Okay, so we've got obsolete infrastructure. Classic example then is the finger piers that are made obsolete by containerisation. So what do we do with them? We can scrap them, we can destroy them, we can replace them, or we could restore them and adapt them for alternative uses, especially if they're conceived to have historic or architectural merit. And the late 20th century waterfront has provided many opportunities to renovate and redevelop what have become, in many cases, derelict inner city areas. And obsolete port areas have been redeveloped for a variety of uses: residential, commercial, recreational, and there are many examples around the globe. One of the most famous is Canary Wharf in London, but we've got Woolloomooloo Wharf in Sydney, and there's the Quay, which is a bonded warehouse in Dublin. There are many other examples, but they've all required difficult trade-offs between sometimes conflicting objectives. For instance, conservation versus development. And the study of Dublin's dockland and the rejuvenation of Quay came up with this very interesting comment, and that's why I've put it in here. Because the redevelopment of Dublin's dockland suggests that, and I quote, "Whether we value particular popular memories, such as those of the dockers, depends on whether or not they can be constructed as a marketable story." And so the key emphasis here is obviously this notion of marketability, or if you like, of economic sustainability, that if these are to be preserved, then we need to find a marketable story or marketable use for them. Otherwise, they'll probably just end up under the demolition hammer. These are just some of the shots of Quay in Dublin, and basically you start here with moving this direction, so this is before development, and then this is after it's been renovated. The black and white shots are taken from the book by N. Moore, Dublin Docklands Reinvented. Closer to home, at least for me, this is Woolloomooloo Wharf in Sydney. Now, Woolloomooloo Wharf is very interesting. It's I think the longest timber pile wharf in the world. It was built or completed finally in 1915, and given the redevelopment of the port and with containerisation, it went through the classic stages of being run down, derelict, and prime for demolition. But luckily a decision was made to redevelop it. And so you can see the result on the right, which is basically, of course, a very modern complex with hotels, restaurants, coffee shops, and so forth. And so, this Woolloomooloo Wharf has been transformed. So it's a classic example then of adaptive reuse of existing facilities. Now, a key issue in Woolloomooloo, and in many cases, is how do you fund this? And I was very interested when at least one or two of the other presenters have raised this issue of, what is the role for the private sector, for example, in helping to restore some of these infrastructures. And clearly, it's an area where the private sector can play a role, but it needs to be managed very carefully. I won't read you that definition of public-private partnerships in the cultural sector, but essentially they are an important mechanism for achieving a sustainable outcome. And they can take a variety of forms. You could have short-term collaboration or longer-term partnerships and joint ventures. The key point, though, is they're not sponsorships, they're reciprocal relationships. And they need, obviously, to be managed very carefully to ensure that commercial factors don't override heritage and historic values. Okay, turning to Fremantle, Western Australia. This is an image of the inner harbour at Fremantle. Basically, originally there was a rock bar across the entrance, and until that was blasted away at the end of the 19th century, the harbour wasn't of much practical use. But that was eventually removed. The North Quay and the South Quay were built, and so Fremantle had a modern harbour with reasonable depth of water. Over the years, of course, there's been huge redevelopment, but the obvious one in the foreground here is the new Maritime Museum, which was opened in 2002. Here's another shot of Victoria Quay, looking towards the Maritime Museum from the opposite direction. That's a Port Authority building built in the 1960s, but still being used. And here we have examples of the old wharf sheds, which are still there in varying states of repair, but they're often many of them are used for storage. One's used for a ferry terminal, and there's a cafe and so forth. This shed here is called E-Shed. It was moved from this area here back to here. It was renovated, and it's now full of shops, boutique shops, and is a bit of a magnet for the tourists off the cruise ships, which regularly call into Fremantle. Now, the development or redevelopment of Victoria Quay has been an ongoing issue. It's of considerable historical interest. Obviously, the port's played a key role in the development of Western Australia. It's been associated with historic personalities. Sir John Forrest, who was the first Premier of Western Australia and who led the development of the state. C.Y. O'Connor, who was the engineer who opened it up. And over the years, there have been many changes in the functions of the wharf, which have caused redundancy of many of the old existing buildings. So the issue was, what do we do with them, and how do we restore Victoria Quay? And this highlights many of the common challenges that occur when you're dealing with waterfront restoration. The issue of overlapping areas of responsibility. In Australia, we have federal government areas of responsibility, state government areas, and local government areas. And there is actually very often, unfortunately, a fourth area of no responsibility. And so you get all these issues that can lead to conflict. You get conflicts between the social and commercial uses of the waterfront space, which I've already referred to. For example, one of the classics is the preference of developers to build high housing for high-income earners in the area, which drives out people on lower incomes. And then, of course, you've got that pressure to the development versus retaining historic structures. Heritage politics can become very heated, and it certainly has in the case of Fremantle from time to time. And the Fremantle Society is a very active lobbying group for the preservation of Fremantle's heritage. Sometimes they get a little bit carried away. There was a massive debate about these old grain silos, which used to be on North Quay. The Port Authority wanted to knock them down, and the Fremantle Society wanted them retained. One of their members described them as industrial cathedrals. Well, I think that was probably pushing the point. But anyway, the Port Authority won that one and knocked them down. But most of the existing structures on Victoria Quay, that is the southern part, have been retained, and as I said, have been through a process of readaptation for alternative uses. This has helped Fremantle, much to its surprise, I suspect, get a very high ranking in Lonely Planet's Best Travel Guide. The latest one listed it number 7 in the world's top 10 cities to visit. So I guess you should, if you haven't, you should visit it. But the redevelopments highlighted these key challenges that continually face redevelopment of ports. The Port Authority says the most authentic or important authentic form of heritage is the maintenance of the inner harbour as a working port. So they want it to continue as a working port. I and many of others have argued that in fact you're better off moving the port, most of the port activities down south, away from the urban area because of the problems that are occurring with traffic congestion, particularly with container trucks rumbling through narrow city streets. And many residents of Fremantle have complained, and I quote, they want or it's been said that they want a boutique port which doesn't have trucks rumbling, livestock smelling, and things that go bang in the night. And so here we have that classic dilemma, you know, okay, it's very nice to have a working port, but do you really want to be living next door to one, particularly when you've got lots of smelly cattle being handled? So, and these are very much ongoing issues, actually, in relation to the role of the inner harbour as a commercial port. In the long run, I think the container operations will be transferred out, but there's a lot of debate about when the long run is. Okay, I'm conscious of my time, so I just want to draw together a few conclusions. The first point, I think, is that maritime infrastructure is often overlooked. It is, however, a rich source of our cultural heritage. It can help us understand our maritime inheritance. And because it's long-lived, if we maintain, if we look after it, it can be kept to be enjoyed by many generations in the future. Obviously, its functions change. Technological and economic change can make some infrastructure obsolete, even if it's still perfectly sound from a physical point of view. And so this then leads to the challenge, do we scrap it, do we restore it? And the whole debate about how much historic value there is in a particular piece of infrastructure. And this, I think, in order to have informed decision-making on this, we need to say, okay, well, let's try and look at both the market value and non-market values of maritime infrastructure. The risk is if we only look at the market values, then we may destroy some infrastructure which has enormous contributions from a non-market point of view in terms of intrinsic value, existence value, value to indigenous peoples, and so on. And so I think we need to look at both market and non-market values, although of course the latter are notoriously hard to evaluate. But certainly informed decision-making should take both into account. Inevitably, there are many conflicting issues, so it can be difficult to develop a shared vision, and there have often been very bitter conflicts about redevelopment issues, whether they're in the Dublin docks or Fremantle docks or London or wherever. The real problem is that sustainable redevelopment requires trade-offs between cultural heritage, economic development, and very often the needs of working infrastructure. And we've certainly had this latter tension very much in the case of Fremantle. If it's to be a working port, then inevitably that puts constraints on what other activities can take place there. For example, the Maritime Museum was built right on the water's edge, as I showed in that image, but only after a very tough battle with the Port Authority, which really did not want a maritime museum so close to its working port. But I think in the papers so far we've had some very powerful points being made by speakers. For instance, about ports being de-peopled and automated ports, decoupled from people, from popular culture. And Stephen has given us that rather gloomy prediction about future interest in maritime culture. I hope he's wrong. I hope that it can be sustained, but the struggle is always finding the trade-offs, finding acceptable trade-offs between the different uses of particular land. And this is always going to be a pressing and difficult issue when that land has high value for alternative uses. So in the case of Fremantle, for example, the land near the port, the inner harbour, has high value for alternative uses, for recreational use, for housing use and so forth. And that always leads to pressure, particularly when the aim is to try and maintain some of that historical and traditional infrastructure. So there are many issues there, but I think obviously there's a growing view, certainly in many citizen groups, that we should certainly maintain as much of this historic infrastructure as we possibly can. Thank you.